Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Silas House about Dead Men Blues. In this book, Silas is writing under the pen name S.D. House. Silas is a New York Times best-selling author and a multi-award-winning author, including the 2022 Duggins Award. And Silas is also the former poet laureate of the great state of Kentucky. Welcome, Silas.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
I'm very excited. So I told Silas before we started recording, I was introduced to him through his former book, Southernmost. My friend Bart had recommended it to me. He loved it, and so did I. So once again, you sort of set it in, well, this one is Middle Tennessee, where the other one, Middle Kentucky, where the other one was Middle Tennessee on the border. And I believe you grew up in that area or somewhere similar to there. Is that right?
Yeah, I grew up pretty near the Tennessee border, but in Kentucky. This is set about 2 hours from Nashville, right on the Kentucky-Tennessee border.
I can say I lived, in 2018, I lived in Eastern Tennessee for almost a year. Some of the most gorgeous topography you'll see in this country is along the borders there.
Yes.
And do you like living in the big city now compared to living in the country, or do you miss the country life, or do you visit a lot, or?
Yeah, I live in Lexington and I love it. I really love it. I'm always homesick for the mountains, but I'm really happy here. I love it. It's got a vibrant writing community, a queer community. So everything I need.
So I rarely do comparisons, so forgive me for this because I am going to do a little comparison. Your writing reminds me some of Joshua Moling. There's an easiness to it. You both created a sheriff. Both sheriffs are somebody that every reader will fall in love with. So give us a little idea about who your sheriff is and where he is at the beginning of the story.
Well, this is the first book in a series, so you're just starting to get to know him.
Yes.
When we meet him, he's starting all over in his life. He's lost everything. His best friend has had an affair with his wife, and through a series of complications, that has led to him losing his job as well. And so he's just, sort of looking at it as a clean slate, and he's depressed, but he's also happy to be starting over from scratch. And he's living on a houseboat, and he doesn't really have anything except a bunch of record albums and his little wiener dog, Shorty, who is his fierce protector. And he ends up having to work with his ex-best friend because 2 murders have happened in their little town, and he's really the only person who can solve them. So I think, he's an underdog, and he messes up a lot, but I think he's more likable because of that.
I think so too. And I thought he's very smart. Let's put it that way. He's a good investigator. And I think, or I know, not from experience, but I know from reading that, it's very easy for us to sort of watch the news and say, well, I would have done it differently. But I think it's very different when it's boots on the ground because, you have to investigate. You really have to find out who done it, and you got to get the clues, and you've got to piece it together. And I really thought you did a great job in giving him some roadblocks along the way, obviously, because that's what we all want to read about. But he also is somebody you really, really root for. I want the man to win.
Yes. Well, one reason I said it in 1955 is because I wanted it to be a mystery where the detective has to depend on his intuition and just interviews. There's not a lot of technology at his disposal in the 1950s in this small town. And so he really just has to rely on his wits, to figure it out. And that made it more challenging to write, but it also made it more interesting. I left out that he's also bisexual. So I thought it would be interesting to have a sheriff in a small town in the 1950s who's bi. And you just learned that in this book. I'll get to explore that more later.
It's one of the things that, especially like with Agatha Christie's Marple, is one of my favorite sleuths. And the reason is because I grew up in a very small town, population of maybe 400 if we were lucky. You get to really realize what human nature is about by looking at the people around you. And I think when I get a chance to read an author who sets their stories in a small town, especially if they too are from a small area, you see that I'm going to put myself in there, that we have a keen sense of right and wrong, because that's what goes on in small towns. There's the haves and the have-nots, but you also see the same maybe 8 or 10 different personalities in everyone you meet. And so there are times that I noticed that he would say, oh, well, this was similar to something else that he'd already experienced in life. And I know that for me, I think having grown up in a small town, that's something we see a little easier than people who live in a large city. I think if you grow up in Los Angeles, where I live, or New York, maybe the personalities aren't as distinctive as they are in the country.
Right.
Do you feel that way?
Oh, for sure. And also, there's no anonymity in these little towns. Like, everybody knows everything about you, and they know everything about your grandpa, and for generations. And a lot of judgments are made because of that history and all that. So, yeah, it's there are a lot of pros and cons to it.
So, who was your besides Dave? Who was your favorite character to write?
Well, she's more of a minor character in this book, but she'll become a larger character. Her name is Sheila Shepherd, and she's sort of she's described as dowdy, and she just doesn't care what anybody thinks of her. She doesn't, put much store in her looks or anything. She's just about doing her job well. And it won't be revealed till later, but I'm pretty sure I think she's a lesbian, and that will come into play in the book. She just doesn't kowtow to men in any way. And she's the sheriff's secretary, but she could be running. She should be sheriff because she's smarter than the sheriff. She's smarter than anybody else. She has a real droll sense of humor. So I enjoyed writing her because of that sense of humor, and how she just, she just doesn't care what anybody thinks. And I love that about her.
Yeah, I think it takes a special kind of personality in a small rural area to be that person, to be the person that says, you know what, this is me. You either like it or you don't. Because I think that is a downside about growing up in a small area, that there's so much pressure to fit in or be accepted or to do the right thing, whatever that thing is,
Yeah.
And, I know that. So in Dave's baggage, it's very obvious he feels guilty about where his life has landed him. He is, as you say, rebuilding it, but you can see that he only sees that he's made a perceived mistake. But I love it that another character in the book says, you're probably a little more popular now than you were before. And I think that that was something good to read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we are our own harshest critics. We're harder on ourselves than anybody else is, and I do think that some people do appreciate somebody that has screwed up publicly and has suffered in front of everybody, and so it's made him more likable. Whereas he thought it would ruin him, but actually it's made him more lovable.
I like that. And there's some things which I won't give away, but there's some truisms that Dave recognizes at the end of the novel that it was a lovely reveal for him to come to these realizations, that some of the things that he had put on himself for the last year might not be quite what it really was. These might have been some things he had made up in his mind. And I think that, in real life, that's a really great growing point. So I think that gives Dave a lovely place to start off on the next adventure.
Yeah. When you're writing a murder mystery, on one hand, You want it to be really propulsive. You want the pages to turn. And so you want to keep it on the plot, on the crime and the investigation. But you also want to make your characters really rich, and you want them to have an interior life. Because, when I think about my favorite murder mysteries, I'm usually not thinking about the actual element of suspense, the murder, as much as I'm thinking, well, you mentioned Jane Marple. I read an Agatha Christie novel because I love Jane Marple and
Yes.
because I love her little village of Mary Green and things like that. It's about the place and the characters. So I was trying to strike that balance of it being a page turner, but also I want you to want to revisit this place and these characters.
And something you do that I don't find to be the easiest thing to do, Silas, and I'm gonna pat you on the back, is there's a couple of times where you mention light bread. Now, if you're Southern, you know what light bread is. But now,
Yeah.
if you're from Minneapolis, I'm not sure you know what light bread
Yeah.
is. We call it different things in different parts of the country.
Yeah.
But you give us these small Southernisms or small Southern details in your writing that if you're Southern, you instantly recognize what it is that you, the author, are trying to tell me about. And of course, I love it because I recognize my childhood. So it's like, I love that. But then you also did something that I really, really, really appreciate as a reader. You write in regular English, but if it needs an explanation of what he sounded like when he said it, you give us that, as in pretty and purdy.
Right.
And I have a hard time reading what I call colloquialism writing because it's not really the word. I mean, we may pronounce it purdy, but the word is pretty. And
Right.
that's the way it's spelled.
Yeah, I don't like it when authors spell out things phonetically, in the dialogue itself. So I just try to give that, a sense of that every once in a while. And if you get enough of that, then the reader will hear how the character's speaking all the time.
That's right. That's right. So, have you lived on a houseboat before?
No, but I've always daydreamed of living. Sometimes it would just be wonderful to just get rid of everything and downsize and just live on a houseboat and have that magnificent view of the lake in front of you. So, yeah, maybe someday if I sell enough of these books, I can buy me a houseboat.
Yes, and I will say that I think the majority of people would say, "Oh, well, they can't be very expensive." But having lived in Eastern Tennessee for a year, I can tell you that some of those houseboats are really tricked out and aren't cheap. And I can imagine the marinas that are being built one after another aren't cheap to house them in
Right.
either, because you have to build these marinas from scratch in these
Mhm.
places.
Yeah.
So, did you? So I know that you grew up on the border. Did you spend a lot of time at the lakes growing up?
My family, when we went on vacation, we only went to Gatlinburg or the lake. And for those who don't know, Gatlinburg is like a resort town in the Smokies, and it's near Dollywood. So everybody knows Dollywood. But we didn't go very far. And so we usually were on the lake for any kind of vacation. I grew up very near the lake too. So it was just part of everyday life in warm weather to be skiing and fishing and on the boat and picnicking out on an island. And it was just a way of life. And lake life is a really specific way of being, and it's wonderful, and I love it. And so I wanted to take the reader to that and give them that little escape.
Well, and I'm glad you did, because I will say that in my time in Tennessee, I was outside a lot. I worked with a company that did insurance inspections,
Mhm.
and I was the first of our group to get assigned a lake house region.
Hmm.
And when I got there, so my job was to take photos to make sure, number one, the place existed, and number two, it was insurable. The first time I had to do one, some kid who was like 16 years old put me on his personal boat and drove me way out in the middle of nowhere, what I thought was nowhere, to take photos of a houseboat. And, because everybody knows everyone, he knew where I was going. But, I will say I did hear a little bit of Deliverance playing in the background, because I'm like, number one, I don't swim. Number two, I have no idea where I am. GPS
Right.
stopped working an hour ago.
Yeah.
And I'm like, holy cow. But the peacefulness and the serenity of it was something that I would be hard pressed to describe and do a good job of it, because it was just something very, very different. So I certainly could see the attraction and draw
Yeah,
to that.
yeah.
Now, are you a big jazz and blues fan in real life, or
I
is
love,
this just Dave?
yeah, I love all music. I'm a very eclectic. I think Dave is more into the blues than I am. So I listened to it a lot more while I was writing this book and got to know it better, especially the blues of the time period. And the other thing is, he loves the blues like Bessie Smith and Ella Fitzgerald and Etta James and all that, but he also loves the country blues like the Carter Family and Hank Williams. And so it's sort of two worlds in a way.
Well, and I'm a huge music fan, and I'm an enormous jazz and R&B and blues fan, but not as old as Bessie Smith blues.
Hmm.
But I do realize the direct correlation that the blues by Bessie Smith and the early country artists had on each other.
Right.
There's in Bristol, Virginia, there's a bluegrass museum, and they have a lot of what we would call black blues from the 20s,
Yeah.
and how it figured in so closely with what was race and hillbilly music at that time. And I loved that correlation that you drew for Dave, because he feels like that's real music to him,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think that's the thing about Dave. You really do get to meet a fully formed character who he has his specific likes and dislikes. You bring him with a backstory and baggage, but part of that is his love of music.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. Well, that's always really important for me in creating a character. If I can figure out what their favorite song is or their favorite type of music, it really helps me to know them better. And so then I just transfer that to the reader. And in the very first scene, he's listening to this song called Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out. And it just instantly tells you a lot about his state of mind, where he is in his life, who he is, and all that.
and I love his friend Rex.
Me too.
Rex is what I guess in today's world we'd call that ride or die friend.
Yeah.
He says to Dave at the end that, I'm glad to have you back. You basically, you've been a miserable bum for a year, but it's nice to see you returning to your normal self, so to speak.
Right.
But then he says, I'm going along with you one way or another. And that's that kind of friend you really do want to have.
Yes. Yeah, he was a fun character to write. He's British. He's a former monk who decided he didn't want to be a monk anymore, and so he owns the marina. And he, even though he left the priesthood, he's a great theologian, and so he's helpful that way in solving this particular crime, because there's some religious overtones and things like that. So I loved him.
Yes, and it is true. This will be the second time I've quoted Gone with the Wind on this podcast, but there's something that Scarlett O'Hara's father says, that there's nothing more important than the land.
Right.
And I can tell, probably, I'm assuming here, you're of English or Irish descent, as well as I am. And I know growing up, that was the one thing I heard at every family gathering, how important the land was, And land figures into this. And there's land and love is something that's sort of joked about several times, but it is true about an experience for rural people, because land is power and it is money, and the lack of it causes a lot of heartache often.
Yeah, sort of the thing throughout the book is that all the Rex says most crimes in this area are committed for love or land or both, and so that's certainly true in this book. It's a lot about ownership and corruption and all that.
Well, and I think ownership is another word. It's not important to go into, but you also showed the reader about ownership in several places, not only land, but as in humans as well. And I think that that's always something that you would think in 2025 it wouldn't be nearly as relevant as it is, but it is truly relevant today as it was in the 1950s, for sure.
Yeah, and it was really important for me to, I'm setting the book in the 1950s. So it was really important for me to, even though it is an escapist sort of novel, there's not a lot of social commentary, but I also wanted to make it clear that the 50s wasn't great for everybody.
No,
And that there are a lot of people who don't have their rights and things like that. And so that comes into play sometimes.
it does. And that lack of a telephone in some places was like, oh, because I do remember those days where if the phone was out, you had to go to the store to make a phone call.
Right. Yes.
Well, I remember party lines. There were 16 of us on
Sure.
one line when I was growing up. So, how
That's
life has changed.
that's where I learned all about the birds and the bees, by listening in on my neighbors on the party line.
I love that. Okay, Silas, that's got to be a plot point in your next book.
Yes.
End of story, must happen. So again, the book is Dead Man Blues. It's by Silas House. It is highly recommended. And I loved this. Thank you so much for being a guest.
Thank you, Dan. What a pleasure.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.